And I can feel the net of time closing around myself, not in any terrible way. I mean, we're all gonna die, newsflash. But I'm going away in a few weeks. Not that I'll talk about that too much, but just to say, I'm trying to get through you on Christianity, the new Gnosis, and the world turned inside out before that, and it's difficult. Like, there's a lot here, right? And I'm at page 101 of about 232. So I need to keep going. So this is chapter 4, Coming Home, with Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and the Angel Out Ahead. Section 2, Mundus Imaginalis. And I think the summary is really valuable here. So please watch episode 10 first, because I don't have time to go over it all again. We're going to continue from here. And it's going to be like, if someone just finds this as a one-off, it's like, what the hell? And yeah, it's pretty far out. And that summary for me really, really helped. So, Mundus Imaginalis. Where does the event, sorry, two questions arise. Where does the event of becoming conscious occur? And who is the angel that the soul meets? Okay, what this means is that this event of becoming conscious is this epiphany that we were speaking about in Heideggerian language, that Corbin thinks about as a kind of quite active presence, this sort of soul becoming aware of itself, and then from out of that awareness, being able to interiorize different spiritual universes and take up the point of view of eternity, I would say. Okay, and so the idea is that where does that event of becoming conscious occur? And immediately I'm going to want to say necessarily, I think it occurs within a community of practitioners running an ecology of practices. Um, I think of that as a kind of existential location. And I think we can mean where in a more ontological way. I mean, we'll see what Tom Cheetham means by where, but I mean, no, there are literally going to be physical locations, and if unless you go to those locations and practice and live in that way, then you're not going to get this quote unquote event of becoming conscious. The idea that living in a certain way unlocks specific affordances that have to do with existential awareness. And I wouldn't say, I would say it's definitely possible to have sort of events of becoming conscious in other contexts, but I would suggest that they're much harder to. I mean, the whole point of a monastery model or a wisdom school is that there's a whole vibe, and everyone can vibe together. And that can there are challenges that come with that, but it's also an amazing benefit, this net of collective intelligence. And so even if there is elsewhere and in a nomadic way, an event of becoming conscious, I think that's going to be much harder to maintain unless there is a home for that in a literal physical location as well as ontologically. So that was the first question. Regarding the second question, quote, who is the angel that the soul meets? I have to say, forgotten that the soul was meeting an angel. And it remains to be seen. I think there's a way that when we can take up the perspective of the soul in the way that's been described elsewhere before, the world appears in an imaginal way. It appears in a personified way. And one way of talking about such phenomena, such images, is as angels. But we had the idea that through the soul, the imago or image, capitalized, sort of can come through one, sort of equivalent to the Jungian self. And so here it gets a little tricky because following the stuff of the new Gnosis, I would regard the soul, I might regard the soul as a kind of daimon, Socratic daimonion, Vivekian sacred second self. or Jungian anima, all equivalent. The idea would be that there are not only a multitude of quote unquote angels, but specific daimons that can be available in dialogue with the soul, or from out of the point of view of the soul. They can be engaged relationally. But I think it gets very tricky here because we have to start being specific about, well, what do we mean by the soul? Is it a particular daimon, or is it more of a quality that can infuse any expression? And I don't know. And so I'll try to be as careful as I can, and let's move on and see what Cheetham says. I got 2 sentences in. So again, Mundus Imaginalis, 2 questions arise. Where does the event of becoming conscious occur? And who is the angel that the soul meets? In order to begin to answer the first, the where question, and to investigate the nature of this place, we need to return to that primordial mythic sense of space that we encountered earlier as central to the notion of presence. As we are not objects in historical time, so we are not primordially in quantitative space. Human presence spatializes a world around it in accordance with the mode of being of that presence. The human presence spatializes a world around it in accordance with the mode of being of that presence. As is the case for primordial time, the space of this primary presence is a qualitative, discontinuous space. Okay, so essentially what he's going to do is sort of take the logic that we were using regarding time, sort of stepping out of the linear progression of time and sort of toward the vantage point of eternity, which involves the kind of the perception, the epiphanic awareness that this linear time is a sense that derives from out of the soul. And here the notion is that the same thing is true of space. So space and time going together in this way. Both of them are connected with the Great Mother, archetypally, mythologically speaking, along with fate, but I won't go in that mythic direction at the moment. Okay, so what does he mean? So he's talking about the where question in relation to space. So what happens to our sense of space in this mode of being? Quote, if we are limited to the quantitative space of the res extensa, as Descartes, we will be unable to apprehend the objective reality of any other kind of extension, any other kind of space. The limited space in which the matter of the scientists exists, in which objects appear, is the most limited and constricted of all the kinds of spaces there are. Okay, so here essentially we have the idea that there are other kinds of spaces. There are other kinds of space. I'm reminded here of the current ongoing work of Michael Levin, who should definitely Google and listen to what Michael Levin is saying because it's amazing. This is the idea that there are other quote unquote state spaces, I think you would call. And so the scientific view, the scientific perspective has maybe not only limited our sense of time in the way that we were describing, but also limited our sense of space. It's almost as if we see everything through a Cartesian graph in a certain way. And again, the notion is that this is in fact the case, that we are unconsciously aware of a structure or a Cartesian graph that is actually within constituting part of our awareness, and we're trying to notice that and become conscious of that. The idea is that by starting to approach different kinds of space, firstly with the notion that there are other kinds of space, we can come to realize that. Anyway, I'll continue here. He says, the limited space in which the matter of the scientists exists, in which objects appear, is the most limited and constricted of all the kinds of spaces there are. I think I could imagine kinds of spaces that would be more limited and constricted. But anyway, he says, it is restricted to the quality of the quantitative and to that alone. It is the vast realm of spiritual or qualitative spaces that provides the places of the events of the soul. Again, quote, it is the vast realm of spiritual or qualitative spaces that provides the places of the events of the soul. Okay. These provide a kind of limitless fourth dimension into which unfold the mysteries of the soul. It's going to keep going a little. The realm of spiritual space is both more real and more primordial than the abstract qualitative space of Descartes and Newton. Okay, I think I would summarize this by simply saying that, quote unquote, there is a, you could say, so hard to language this, but spiritual realm. I mean, oh, I just want to roll my eyes. So it seems to be, I would talk about a mode of being that has to do with, I would say, spiritual sensitivity, taking up the perspective of the soul and of different cosmologies that opens our sense of different modes of being present. And the idea being that if we consider that practice to be connected to our spirituality, well, we have the idea that that practice of spirituality, which includes but is not limited to work with the soul, has a quality of opening space. So spirituality as a resource, not only emotional space, inner space within which we can hold inner conflict, for example, but the idea that a spiritual cosmology or a world is a space into which a space that we can become present to that we haven't noticed, that we've been stuck without. And then there's a further claim. So it has a limitless quality, which strikes me as a little risky, but certainly it seems to, it's not, it might not have the qualities of being bound or limited in the way that we normally understand physical concrete reality, let's say. I would say furthermore that it's deeply involved with the world. So it's not sort of up and out into sort of just what seems like an abstracted Gnostic mysticism, but it's kind of a way of being more present. It's about seeing the world as it is in a different way. So I would want to push on the distinction between matter and spirit. They're going together. And then a further point that this is Cheetham's point, that spiritual space, quote unquote, that I'm saying can be made present through practice, spiritual practice, is more real and more primordial. And that's a claim. Okay, so what does he mean? I'm going to try and let him keep speaking. This Cheetham. He says, in the Timaeus, Plato speaks of that out of which all things are generated. The nurse, the receptacle, quote, that we may liken to a mother, or a womb, quote, that partakes of the intelligible, but is yet most incomprehensible. Timaeus says, of this receptacle and nurse of all creation, we have only this dreamlike sense, being unable to cast off sleep and determine the truth about it. It exists only as, quote, an ever-fleeting shadow. Ivan Illich comments, quote, in these delightful lines, Plato still speaks of the image-pregnant stuff of dreams and imagination, as one who still has the experience of living in pre-categorical, founded space. That is, in the pre-Cartesian, pre-Newtonian space of qualities. Okay, wow, that was a lot. It's actually not very complicated. It's a very tortured way to say something which I would consider to be quite simple. So we're talking about the mother, the womb, the nurse, the receptacle. This is a particular mythic category that I would connect with the number four and the Pythagoreans in that vein, also through Jung. And so what I'm connecting here is that I'm going to make a very small historical argument that I've made further in other places, in, for example, episode 3 in Psychological Types. When we lost shamanism in the move from a hunter-gatherer way of living to an agrarian way of living, as in when we started staying in one place in a sedentary way in the Holocene, well, we lost the functionality of shamanism. And specifically, that involves losing access to reliable and potent mystical experience. And I think of that as, I mean, so, and there's a certain normativity connected to mystical experience, as in when we're talking about gnosis, well, mystical experience is, empirically defined now. That is the sine qua non of gnosis, as far as I'm concerned. And I think then there's obviously a further argument that the most reliable and potent manner of accessing mystical experience is through psychedelics, which is an empirical claim that anyone can go find out for themselves. But it's obviously not the only way. And that's why we have these transformative techniques relating to gnosis. I might mention breath work as a breath work facilitator, by the way. And I might mention this kind of philosophy, right? So like philosophy that leads to mysticism, mystical experience, like that. But the whole category of gnosis and the mystical experiences that can be occasioned through Gnostic practice, the whole point of them is that they remind us. They come with amanesis, a remembering of something that we've forgotten. So we've been cut off. We've been cut off from that. We've been cut off from gnosis. And the idea being that we're discovering it again here through philosophy. We're reading about something and it's like, oh, wow, that's an interesting idea. Or maybe it's like, oh, that's a terrible idea. It's like, well, this didn't used to be philosophy. It used to be very much a living, breathing reality that we know that we didn't have to get into arguments about. And so the quality of that comes, well, yeah, so then I'm wanting to make a further claim, and that there is a connection between the Great Mother, this archetypal category that I mentioned that has to do with the mother, the womb, the receptacle, the Holy Grail is similar, the void, the body, the unconscious, the number four. All of this is connected to mystical experience. There is a deep interrelationship between those two. I would then want to say, of course, mystical experiences are by no means limited to or reducible to the symbolism that is associated with the Great Mother archetype. But I am saying, of course, that this is an important, uh, let's say, subcategory or subclass of mystical experience. And that's what's being talked about here. Plato, I mean, we know now that Plato and those other ancient Greek boys, they were, yeah, the mysteries, the Delphic Oracle and the mysteries at the Oracle. I can't go on about it, but yeah, they were taking a very powerful substance maybe once in their lifetime and then talking about it. And that's why I would say Plato is talking about this stuff. There's a clear connection here between anagogic assent, the pursuit of wisdom, and gnosis. Okay, so to bring that around, there is a quote unquote event of becoming conscious, of which Corbin and Cheetham are speaking. And that has to do with this program of intentional practice that I've been talking about. And for them, it's through this kind of philosophy involving an epiphany of the soul's awareness of itself. And that mode of presence can change our relationship with time and space. It can change our sense of time and space through I would say through, I could just have to say through spiritual awakening, but that sounds so cliche. But in any case, there is a kind of epiphanic awareness that can change our relationship with time and space, very much out of the Cartesian Newtonian sense that involves a recovery of our sense for spirituality, for soul work in the way that I've described, that's supposed to, in an empirical way, correct for the deficiencies of the left hemisphere that are currently running rampant all over the planet. Yep, and that change in our relationship with time and space has to do with an amanesis, a remembering, has to do with transformative experience, has to do with gnosis, has to do with mystical experience, and a particular class of mystical experience that has to do with experiences of the mother or womb, that archetypal category, who happens to be the one associated with time and space. Here, I just want to mention very briefly why. Why is the Great Mother connected with time and space? I did already know that, but it happens to be here that we're just talking about time and space, and it was Plato who brought up the qualities of, quote, receptacle, mother, womb, and incomprehensible, nurse, ever fleeting shadow, image, pregnant stuff of dreams. So I'm not just projecting this on there, not at all. So now I need to answer the question why. I'm gonna try and answer the question why is that connected with why is the Great Mother connected with time and space? Yeah, so that's obviously, read some comparative mythology, Eliade, Campbell, Neumann. There's a lot of published work on this topic. Many other authors who I haven't named here. Uh, Camille Paglia springs to mind, sexual personae. Anyway, so the Great Mother as space associated with the cosmos or the universe. So she's the kind of the primordial void, the embodiment of the earth, the womb of creation. Pachamama, the mother of the universe, has the term with a broad meaning: world, universe, space, and totality. And as time associated with both eternity and generations. So the flow of generations, the cycles of life, the passing of the seasons. And so broadly, I would say that the Great Mother is connected with the earth and with the conditions of creation, the conditions of this world, this cosmos, whereas the sort of Great Father is connected with the divine or the beyond, which is sort of out of these conditions, like unlimited by them. And so time and space are in some way the foundational laws or constraints of this universe as we know it. And that's a quality of connected with the mother. Okay, now I have to bring this around a little bit, and I'm gonna stop in a bit because I want this to be shorter and more accessible. So we were talking about, well, I think it's pretty clear what we were talking about. We're talking about this active presence that changes our sense for space as well as for time, out of the Cartesian Newtonian sense and toward Gnosis, toward mystical experience, toward Amanesis of the um, quote, limitless fourth dimension into which unfold the mysteries of the soul. So this is just their way of talking about it. And he says, I'll just read it. I'll read the quotes from Plato again. So it says, in the Timaeus, Plato speaks of that out of which all things are generated, the nurse, the receptacle, quote, that we may liken to a mother, or a womb, quote, that partakes of the intelligible, but is yet most incomprehensible. Timaeus says, of this receptacle and nurse of all creation, we have only this dreamlike sense, being unable to cast off sleep and determine the truth about it. It exists only as an ever-fleeting shadow. So this is the myth of the cave through and through. This is anagogic ascent. This is escape from the matrix. I don't want to be too Gnostic about it, but Ivan Illich comments, in these delightful lines, Plato still speaks of the image-pregnant stuff of dreams and imagination as one who still has the experience of living in a pre-categorical, founded space. The notion that it's not simply about state-bounded, temporally bounded, temporary immersion experiences, but that a culture which can support Gnosis, can support this kind of ecology of practices that I've been describing, can support a way of living that is sensitive to this greater space and greater time. Okay, where from there? He says, this is Cheetham, this Platonic and Neoplatonic notion of spatiality, which Henry Moore and the Cambridge Platonists called spicitudo spiritualis, or spiritual condensation, describes the world of visionary events. Okay? I think it's so easy to get lost in all this because it's something that's very real, very available. And if we get lost in the philosophy, then it's such a profound danger. But anyway, it says, it is the world of Emanuel Swedenborg's heaven. These spaces indeed have extension, but are not evaluated according to that calculus. They're measured by the states of the soul. So this is Neoplatonic through and through. I mean, the Christian and Gnostic and Hermetic traditions all align in terms of talking about talking about aspirational development as the sort of liberation of the soul or redemption of the soul. The idea that releasing the soul through the stations along the way is a normativity, is a something to do. That's what we're here to do. That is common to many, 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 many different traditions, including, it seems to me, Platonism, Neoplatonism, as well as a huge chunk of what Corbin is talking about. There's a good episode on that in What is the Daimon in the new Gnosis series. So I'm going to stop in a minute, but I want to offer something one little bit further. So now we get a quote from Corbin. Quote, spaces which are measured by inner states presuppose essentially a qualitative or discontinuous space of which each inner event is itself the measure, as opposed to a space which is quantitative, continuous, homogeneous, and measurable in constant measures. Such a space is existential space. whose relationship to physico-mathematical space is analogous to the relationship of existential time to the historical time of chronology. Okay, so very simply, we have this idea that, well, there's two different senses of time. There's the linear time of chronology, right? And eternity, which is stepping outside of time. We can also step into deep time, but that's different. Read Chris Bache if you want to know about deep time. Chris Bache, LSD in the Mind of the Universe. And so the idea is that space is something similar. So in a way, there's a way of in a Cartesian Newtonian way of relating with space, then it's sort of quantitative, continuous, homogeneous, and measurable. And there's a different sense of space that we can access through gnosis, through mystical experience, through this kind of philosophy of which they speak. And that those kinds of spaces are existential spaces. They have a spiritual quality. They're measured by states of the soul. Okay, then Cheetham says, this conception of space is based upon presence or awareness, Dasein, being there, rather than upon any sort of quantitative framework. And in it alone is it possible to speak of personification. For what would a world without face or features, without, that is to say, a look, actually be? One thinks of the Islamic precept, never strike at the face. It would be a world entirely lifeless, wholly mechanical, a world with no soul, no presence, whatever. Okay, I need to try and say what that means. So we're talking about a conception of space, which is non-Cartesian, having a more existential quality, analogous to what eternity is to chronological time. And the way that I've talked about that so far is as if it's something outside, something away that we can find. But the idea is that we are actually people, we are personified from out of such a depth of our own being. So it's not something, it's not a kind of existential state that is sort of far away that we have to reach. It's actually from out of that kind of existential space that we live already. So it's something that is unconsciously constituting our being in the world that we haven't noticed, that we can notice. This is the meaning of Amanesis, to remember that which already is, clearly connected to aletheia as unveiling, truth as unconcealing that which is, phenomenology, letting it be what it is. And so the idea is that we are actually existentially grounded and rooted already at this level of being in this kind of space and time. And from out of that level of being, we personify. We appear as the ego, we appear as whatever character we appear as. So there's like, I'll give myself as an example. So there's a being there, there's Dasein being there. And within that existential space, I take on an identity of the ego, Sam. I am Sam. But notice how that's a descriptive quality. Sam is smaller than all of being here. So it's something that's taken on like a clothing, right? This is the egoic identity. And within that story, for example, if I'm, let's say, Sam the scientist, I mean, I'm not, but you know, imagine that I were, then we see that when we take on a personality and identity, that we see the world, we experience time and space in a certain way, namely the way of the scientist, for example. So what we're talking about is a way of practicing with intention in the Neoplatonic and Platonic style, let's say, with elements of Gnosticism and strands of, let's say, Sufi mysticism through Corbin at the moment, that can reveal in an experiential, existential way, involving philosophy but not limited to philosophy, the deeper layers of our existential awareness that are beyond the story of space and time that we've inherited through Descartes. That we can practice taking on different identities, taking off those identities, taking up different perspectives, taking up different worldviews. Personifying in different ways that can allow us to be present flexibly as well as more deeply. And it really is both. I really want to emphasize that it is both. It is the capacity to swap between existential modes when we need to, but it is also the capacity to be more self-reflectively aware of the mode of being that we are currently inhabiting. And those are different. Okay, one more paragraph because it's interesting, and then I'll stop this and continue. So he says, this space, which is the location of visionary events, is called the Alam al-Mithal in Arabic, which Corbin has translated into Latin as the Mundus Imaginalis, or the Imaginal World. In his view, much of the enormous philosophical merit of Surawadi lies in the fact that he was the first to attempt to provide an ontological foundation for reality, whatever that is supposed to mean. So there's a long footnote here, which I will include at the end. So here we have the revelation that what we've been talking about is the Mundus Imaginalis, the Imaginal World, the Alam al-Mithal in Arabic. So what do we mean by this? The footnote says, a good deal has been written about the Imaginal World, especially by archetypal psychologists. Without intending in any way to minimize the central importance of this notion for Corbin, or his spirituals, meaning his spiritual influences, it is one of the purposes of this essay to place it in its proper context, the Imaginal World. In this regard, it is worth noting the comments of William Chittick, student and translator of Islamic texts, most notably Rumi and Ibn Arabi. He studied in Tehran, while Corbin and Sayed Hossein Nasser were teaching there. And he writes, this is William Chittick, Corbin performed the great service of introducing the Western world to many uniquely Islamic ways of expressing philosophical positions. But it is beyond the capacity of a single individual to bring out everything worthy of consideration. Moreover, in his zeal to revive the honor due to the imaginal realm, Corbin tended to de-emphasize the cornerstone of Islamic teachings, Tawhid, the quote, declaration of God's unity. It is as if Corbin was so entranced by the recovery of the imaginal that he had difficulty seeing beyond it. From the point of view of the Islamic intellectual tradition, the tendency to become transfixed by the multiple apparitions of the One represents a danger inherent in the current revival of interest in imagination. It is clear, for example, that certain varieties of Jungianism divinize the imaginal world. giving to the soul an autonomous status never granted to it by the great traditions. Man's own domain of microcosmic imagination is posited as the real, since, quote, God is merely the soul's projection. But this, in the Islamic view, is to fall into the error of associating other gods with God. Shirk. The opposite of Tawhid. We are left with polytheistic multiplicity, and the gods are reinstated as real entities possessing insuperable differences. Corbin never fell into such a position, which would have betrayed the central teachings of the texts with which he was concerned. Nevertheless, if his approach to Islamic thought is to be understood as reflecting the concerns of his sources, it needs to be tempered by more attention to the ultimate unity lying behind the theophanic facade of created existence. Okay, thank you, William Chittick. I have to provide a couple of comments about that at the end. Firstly, I would, without being too familiar with Corbin yet, suggest that he's right and that we want in some way, I see this in Robert Avens as well, there's a sort of tendency toward polytheism and ending up being sort of lost in samsara or maya, the illusion of the imagination, which is exactly what I've been pointing to. And so I would strongly agree with Chittick. The whole point of the underlying unity is extremely important. But again, we want these to be in dialectic. Can we conceive of a way that includes both monotheism and polytheism? And for many people, that's going to be impossibly challenging. I would also suggest that, yes, certain varieties of Jungianism, but that's not the same as what Jung said. The whole point of the autonomy granted to the soul is that these traditions, including the Christian redemption of the soul, the Gnostic liberation of the soul, esotericism in many different places, has to do with freeing the soul, and I would say freeing the soul not for Gnostic ascent up and out of the world, but freeing the soul for deeper participation. And in that context, the autonomy granted to the soul is extremely important. I would suggest we can. I don't want to get into an argument with anyone about that, but the point is that there are mistakes that come from giving the soul too much autonomy, which we saw in sort of the myth of Prometheus in Pandora in the psychological types playlists. We don't want a devotional attitude to the soul who can be capable of doing horrible things, as Jung found out. But to not grant the soul any autonomy is to be a tyrant, and I would say not clearly recognize the nature of the soul. And I'm going to suggest that there's a balance there that comes about through right relationship with the soul. Certainly, it is not the case that, well, it's not true that God is simply the soul's projection in Jungian thought. I don't think that's fair. And it's not exactly that our domain of, quote, microcosmic imagination is posited as the real. It's that the self, or that which is conceived as God in Jungian terms, is beyond all opposites, including microcosm and macrocosm. I mean, this is the Atman Brahman teaching from India. This is something that's very old. And so I want to say that, yeah, Chittick is sort of pushing this, hey, monotheism, one God, unity. It's not about the individual. And I'm like, I feel like there's something important there that we don't want to lose. Anyway, that was about the imaginal world in Corbin, the Alam al-Mithal in Arabic, which is a kind of mythic or yeah, it's a space space of deeper presence, which is the location of visionary events measured by a state of the soul. Okay, and I'm going to come back later on. That was 1, 2, 3 pages, not even full pages, from chapter 4 of The World Turned Inside Out, 101 through 104.